The desert does not forgive weakness. That is the first thing you notice about the Mojave at night. The cold comes fast, faster than anyone expects, and the darkness is total. Not the comfortable dark of a bedroom with curtains drawn. The absolute dark of a place that does not care whether you live or die. It was into this darkness in the autumn of 1942 that several hundred of the United States Army's most senior officers were led, blindfolded, and seated in rows of wooden chairs on the California scrubland outside Camp Pendleton. They had been told only that they were about to see something. No briefing document, no further explanation, just sit down, face forward, and wait. They waited. Then the lights went out. Not the lights of the camp, those were already off. What went out was every assumption those officers had carried with them into that desert. Every certainty about how war was fought, how darkness worked, how a man with a rifle could protect himself in open ground. 13 million candle power erupted from the darkness approximately 400 yards away, a beam so concentrated, so violently white, that the men seated in those chairs did not see light. They saw nothing. Their eyes, flooded beyond any biological tolerance, simply stopped working. Hands flew to faces, men turned away. Seasoned combat veterans who had trained their entire careers for situations of extreme stress were reduced, in under 2 seconds, to men shielding their eyes and stumbling in their chairs. They could not see where the source was. They could not aim at it. The beam flickered on and off twice every second, and that rhythm, that precise, engineered rhythm, turned their pupils into useless instruments, dilating and contracting in a mechanical cycle that human physiology could not override. Some of them tried anyway. They raised their hands as if holding rifles. They pointed at where they thought the light was coming from. They were pointing in entirely the wrong direction. Standing behind the viewing position, hands clasped at the small of his back, a man named Commander Victor Marsh watched all of this without expression. He was 60 years old. His hair had gone white a decade earlier. There were lines in his face that had not been placed there by age alone. He wore his uniform with the automatic correctness of a man who had put it on so many thousands of times that it no longer required thought. But tonight, in this desert, the uniform was almost incidental. What he was wearing, more than anything else, was 26 years of waiting. He had done this before, 4 times before. He had watched the faces of military men transform from skepticism into something they could not name. He had heard the silence that always followed. He had read the polite, carefully worded reports that said, in essence, impressive, but not quite right for us at this time. Tonight felt different. The men in those chairs were different. The world was different. But Marsh had thought that before too. The story does not begin in that California desert. It does not begin in the Second World War. It begins in 1916 in a Navy briefing room in Washington, D.C., where a 34-year-old lieutenant commander named Victor Marsh stood before a panel of 4 officers and proposed, with the careful precision of a man who had been rehearsing for months, that the United States military should consider mounting high-intensity arc lamps on armored vehicles. The concept was straightforward, almost obvious once you heard it. War happened at night. Soldiers in darkness had one enormous advantage over soldiers in light. They could not be seen. But what if you took that advantage away? What if you flooded the battlefield with light so intense that the enemy was not merely visible, but blinded? What if the light itself was the weapon? The panel listened. They nodded in the way that men nod when they have already decided the answer is no, but wish to appear thoughtful. One of them asked about the vulnerability of the light source to enemy fire. Marsh had an answer. Another asked about power generation. Marsh had an answer for that too. A third asked whether this had been tested. It had not yet, but the mathematics were sound. The engineering was feasible. He needed authorization to develop a prototype. The answer was no. Marsh was 34 years old. He had the reasonable expectation of a man his age that a no was a temporary condition. That persistence and evidence would eventually convert a no into a yes. He was not yet old enough to understand that some institutions do not change their minds. They only wait long enough for the person asking to give up. He did not give up. He came back in 1920. He had refined the concept. He had additional calculations, deeper research into the disorienting effect of intense light on human vision, documented case studies from industrial accidents where workers had been temporarily blinded by arc welding at a distance. He presented all of it. The answer was no. In 1925 he presented again. This time a general looked up from the briefing document, studied Marsh for a long moment, and said something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. "Marsh, if this idea is as good as you say it is, sell it to the British. They'll try anything." The room laughed. Marsh did not. He was 43 years old, and he had just been told, with the comfortable authority of a man who would never have to justify the decision, that his life's work was a joke. He walked out of that briefing room, down 3 flights of stairs, through a set of heavy doors, and into the grey Washington morning. He stood on the pavement for a long time, long enough that a passing corporal slowed and looked at him with mild concern. Then Marsh put on his cap and walked back to his office. In 1931, he tried a 4th time. The panel was different. The answer was the same. What transforms a man from stubborn to dangerous is resources. Victor Marsh, by 1933, understood that he would never convince the United States military through argument alone. He had been arguing for 17 years. The War Department's position had not moved by a single degree. What he needed was not better arguments. What he needed was proof so undeniable, so physically present, that no argument would be possible. To build that proof, he needed money he did not have. He found it through Edward Harrington, a New England industrialist who had made his first fortune in rail and his second in steel, and who had the combination of wealth and contrarianism that leads certain men to fund things the establishment has decided to ignore. Harrington had heard about Marsh through a mutual contact, agreed to a single meeting out of mild curiosity, and left that meeting 3 hours later, having committed to fund an entire private research operation. The name they chose was deliberately plain: the Marsh-Petrov Syndicate, a company with no products, no contracts, no customers, one purpose only: to prove that Victor Marsh was right. Marcus Petrov came with the syndicate's name attached because he was the finest optical engineer Marsh had ever encountered. Born in Budapest, trained in Vienna, he had arrived in America in 1927 with a suitcase and a set of technical drawings that described, in precise mathematical language, things that American manufacturing could actually build. He was not a man of speeches. He was a man of tolerances and refractive indices. When Marsh explained what he needed, a searchlight powerful enough to blind, armored well enough to survive return fire, compact enough to mount on an existing tank chassis, Petrov listened without expression, asked 3 very specific questions about power generation, and went away to think. He came back 6 months later with a design. The critical insight was the aperture. Previous attempts at combat searchlights had used wide-beam configurations, floods of light that illuminated large areas but could be located and targeted easily. Petrov's design turned this logic inside out. Instead of a wide beam, a slit, a vertical opening barely 2 inches across, set into an armored cylinder 65 millimeters thick. The arc lamp behind it, carbon electrodes generating plasma at temperatures that turned air into light, was completely invisible from the receiving end. All an enemy would see was the beam itself, and by the time they saw it, they would already be unable to see anything else. The mechanical shutter was Petrov's refinement. 2 cycles per second, not random, not continuous. That rhythm was chosen because it precisely matched and defeated the human pupillary reflex. The eye tries to compensate for sudden bright light by contracting the pupil. It tries to compensate for sudden darkness by dilating. At 2 cycles per second, the eye never catches up. It becomes, in effect, a mechanism in failure, a biological system running a program that no longer works. Marsh watched the first full test of the prototype in January of 1937 and felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in over 20 years of this work. He felt afraid, not of failure, of success, because the thing in front of him, the armored cylinder on the converted chassis, the thin slit of impossible light cutting through the January dark, worked exactly as designed. It worked better than designed. Men positioned 300 yards away could not stand. They covered their faces. They stumbled. One man who had been specifically briefed on what to expect, instructed to maintain his position and attempt to fire a training rifle at the source, managed after 45 seconds of exposure to fire in a direction approximately 90 degrees from correct. The weapon worked. The United States War Department issued formal approval for Project Beacon in the autumn of 1940. Marsh was 58 years old. He had spent more years pursuing this approval than some of the junior officers in the room had been alive. The authorization document was 3 pages long. It authorized production of the armored light system, the conversion of M3 tank chassis, and the establishment of a dedicated training program. He held the document and felt very briefly the weight of 26 years leave his shoulders. He had approximately 72 hours to feel it. The demonstration at Camp Pendleton in 1942 had been arranged with military precision. The senior officers were seated. The lights went out. 6 T-10 vehicles, the official designation was T-10 Shop Tractor, a name chosen to be too dull to investigate, moved into position in the desert dark without sound. The beam came on. And then, in the silence that followed, when the lights had been extinguished and the officers sat recovering their vision, word came that General Dwight Eisenhower, present in the viewing area, wished to see the sequence repeated. The order was given. All 6 beams came on simultaneously. Eisenhower was no longer seated. He had stepped away from the group, moved toward a stand of desert scrub 30 feet from the nearest chair, seeking a moment of private relief after a long evening of military proceedings. When 13 million candle power per vehicle, multiplied by 6, erupted at 400 yards, every officer in the viewing area saw briefly and with complete clarity the general caught in a moment of absolute personal vulnerability. The lights were extinguished in under 4 seconds. The officer who gave that order gave it faster than he had ever given any order in his career. But 4 seconds was enough. The silence that followed lasted several seconds longer than the previous silence. Then a sound moved through the assembled officers that might, in a different context, have been laughter. Eisenhower adjusted his jacket in the dark and said only that the device appeared to be effective. The report he filed the following week was positive, enthusiastic even. Marsh received a copy in his new office. The new office was in the Army's Logistics and Procurement Division, considerably smaller than his previous assignment. No window. The reassignment order had arrived 3 days after the authorization document. It was signed by Brigadier General Walter Cobb, Deputy Director of Special Weapons Classification. The order cited administrative restructuring. It thanked Marsh for his contribution to Project Beacon's development phase. Past tense. Cobb had attended no Project Beacon demonstrations. He had requested no technical briefings. He had not, as far as Marsh could determine, read any of the 300 pages of documentation that Marsh and Petrov had produced over 5 years of private work. What Cobb had done was recognize, with the instinct of a man whose career was built entirely on controlling access to information, that Project Beacon was going to matter. And he had moved, with quiet efficiency, to ensure that when it mattered, the credit would flow in the correct direction. The correct direction was not toward the man who had spent 26 years building it. Marsh sat in his windowless office and read Eisenhower's positive assessment and felt the shape of what had happened settle over him like weather. He was 60 years old. The weapon he had spent his adult life creating was operational, fully tested, and about to enter the largest war in human history. Outside, somewhere beyond the wall of his office, a training exercise was beginning. Engines turning over, young men taking positions, the soft, mechanical sound of a shutter cycling at 2 beats per second, a light preparing to change the war, a light that no one was allowed to ask for. There is a silence that belongs only to the desert at 3 in the morning. Not peaceful, not restful, the silence of a place that has stripped away everything unnecessary and left only what remains when comfort is gone. No insects, no wind, just the cold and the dark and the sound of your own breathing reminding you that you are, improbably, still here. Thomas Aldrich had grown up in Maine, where silence meant snow and pine trees and a frozen lake in January. He thought he understood silence. He was wrong. The Mojave taught him that what he had known back home was silence with furniture in it. Out here, in the Arizona desert near a place called Camp Bows, silence was the whole house. Floor to ceiling, wall to wall, nothing inside it except 18-year-old boys trying not to show each other that they were afraid. He had volunteered in the spring of 1943. Everyone had volunteered. That was the first thing they told you when you arrived. Every man in this compound had raised his hand, been screened, been selected from a larger pool of candidates. You were chosen. That word was supposed to carry weight. For the first few days it did. It carried you through the paperwork, the medical examinations, the bus ride into the desert that lasted long enough to make you genuinely uncertain whether you were still in the United States. Then a sergeant stood in front of 200 young men and told them what they were going to do. He told them almost nothing. There was a weapon. Unlike any weapon currently deployed, its nature was classified at a level most of them did not have clearance to hear described. What they needed to know was this: they would learn to operate it, maintain it, and protect it. They would do this in this desert, in this compound, which they were not to leave except under conditions that would be explained presently. They had been selected for their capacity for discretion. Any violation of the security protocols they were about to receive was punishable under the Espionage Act of 1917. A boy near Aldrich raised his hand and asked what the weapon was. The sergeant looked at him for a long moment. "Son, if I could tell you that, you wouldn't be standing in a desert at 6 in the morning wondering." What Thomas Aldrich learned to do over the following weeks was replace carbon electrodes. The electrode was the heart of the arc lamp. 2 carbon rods positioned precisely, between which an electrical current jumped and created plasma. The plasma was the light was the weapon. But carbon burns. It vaporizes under the heat of its own output, and as it vaporizes, it shortens, and as it shortens, the arc degrades, and eventually the lamp dies. An operator inside the vehicle in total darkness had to reach into the housing wearing asbestos gloves, remove the spent electrodes, and replace them with fresh ones. The housing was hot enough to cause burns through the gloves if you held on too long. The space was tight enough that it had to be done by feel. The engine noise made communication nearly impossible. They practiced this for 6 hours a night, every night, for weeks. Aldrich became very good at it. His hands learned the geometry of the housing independent of his eyes. He could replace a spent electrode in under 90 seconds in total darkness, in a moving vehicle, wearing gloves that cut his tactile sensitivity in half. He was 19 years old, and he was, by any honest measurement, one of the best electrode operators in Camp Bows. He had no idea what he was operating. The T10 shop tractor had been given that name for the same reason that certain programs are given names that discourage questions. A shop tractor suggested maintenance equipment, logistics, something a mechanic worried about, not a general. The men at Camp Baus called them gizmos because that is what soldiers call things they are not permitted to name properly. Aldrich called his the old lady because it was temperamental, required constant attention, and would blind you if you were not careful. In August of 1943, Thomas Aldrich went home on leave. He had been looking forward to this for months. Maine in August. His mother's cooking, the lake. The light of New England, which was the opposite of everything the Mojave had shown him about what light could do. 2 military policemen met him at the bus station and accompanied him to his family's front door. They were not hostile, they were not unkind, they were simply there. In uniform, armed, not going anywhere. They sat in the kitchen while his mother served them coffee they had not asked for. They stood on the porch while Aldrich walked to the end of the driveway to look at the road. They slept in rotating shifts in the living room. His mother took him aside on the second day and asked him, very quietly, what he had done. He told her he hadn't done anything. This was simply how leave worked for his unit. She did not believe him. Why would she? No one she had ever known had come home from service accompanied by armed men who monitored his every movement. The neighborhood had noticed. Old Mr. Patterson from 3 houses down had stopped his wife on the road and asked whether the Aldrich boy had gotten himself into trouble. The woman who ran the general store had given Aldrich a look when he came in for cigarettes, the look of someone who does not want to be associated with whatever has found its way to their door. Aldrich's mother wrote a letter to their state senator 2 weeks after her son returned to Arizona. She asked carefully and with the deference of a woman who had been raised to believe the government generally knew what it was doing, whether her son was under some form of arrest, and if so, whether she was entitled to know the charges. She received, 6 weeks later, a single-typed sentence on official stationery, stamped in 3 places. There is nothing of concern in your son's current assignment. She kept the letter in her kitchen drawer for the rest of her life. She never stopped finding it inadequate. Victor Marsh spent those same months in his windowless office, reading after-action reports from theaters of operation where Project Beacon was not present. This was the shape of his days, reports arriving, maps being updated, positions moving across Europe with the grinding, costly momentum of armies that had enough men to absorb losses that would have ended lesser campaigns, North Africa, Sicily, Italy, the gathering pressure towards something larger. Everyone in Washington felt it. The whole apparatus of Allied planning bending itself toward a single point on the French coast. Marsh read each report with the attention of a man who had spent his career thinking about how light and darkness shaped combat. And in each one he could see exactly where Project Beacon should have been. Night crossings where men died because the far bank could not be illuminated without exposing the light source to fire. Defensive positions that held for days because attacking forces could not move effectively after dark. The balance of each engagement tilting unnecessarily toward the defender simply because darkness favored the waiting over the advancing. He sent formal requests to Cobb's office. 3 in the first 6 months of 1944. Each one identified a specific operational context. Each one included performance specifications, testing data, tactical assessments. Each was written to be not just persuasive but unarguable. The responses came back in language calibrated to communicate nothing. The matter is under continuing review. Operational timing remains at the discretion of Theatre Command. Your submission has been received and logged. Cobb never wrote the responses himself. They came from an aide. What Marsh was still assembling, from fragments and second-hand information and the silence that surrounds things being deliberately not discussed, was the truth at the center of it. Not the official reason for withholding deployment. The preservation of tactical surprise, the hoarding of advantage for the decisive moment, the actual reason, simpler, more human, and far more damaging. Walter Cobb had built his career entirely on controlling access to information. He had risen not by commanding troops or developing strategy, but by knowing which doors to close and when. Project Beacon was the most significant weapons program that had passed through his office in 20 years. When it succeeded, and it would succeed, the testing data was beyond dispute. It would generate the kind of recognition that defined careers, promotions, a name in the right column of the history books. Cobb intended to be in that column. To be there, he needed to control the moment, not Marsh, who had built it, not the field commanders who would use it. Cobb, the man in the middle, the man with the stamp. Normandy came in June of 1944. The Project Beacon units were not deployed. The Seine crossing, the Netherlands, the Hurtgen Forest. Each time the operational window opened, Cobb's office issued the same response: not yet. The men of the 11th Armoured, who had trained for years in Britain, crossed to France and moved through the entire Normandy campaign like ghosts, present, equipped, trained, and never called. In September of 1944, the order came through to surrender all Project Beacon equipment and convert to amphibious vehicles. Thousands of hours of training dissolved with one administrative order. The gizmos were crated, the men moved on. The operational commanders in France, who had planned the campaign to the last supply truck, had never been told the gizmos existed. You cannot request a weapon you do not know is there. The report that arrived on Marsh's desk in January of 1945 had been routed to him because someone in the logistics chain had flagged, without understanding its significance, that it referenced modified tank vehicles with non-standard optical equipment. The 557th Searchlight Battery, operating in northern France, had taken a turretless ram tank, stripped the remaining fittings from the hull, and mounted a 90-centimeter searchlight on the chassis. They had done this because they needed mobile illumination capable of surviving direct fire. The solution had seemed obvious once they thought about it, and no one had told them anything different was possible. They called it a tactical light vehicle. Their after-action notes described it as innovative. Marsh sat in his windowless office and held the report without moving for a long time. 4 years. 10,000 men isolated in an Arizona desert. Hundreds of armored vehicles purpose-built, with arc lamps and armored cylinders and mechanical shutters calibrated to the exact frequency of human pupillary failure. Millions of dollars, Marcus Petrov's tolerances measured in fractions that required a magnifying glass. Boys like Thomas Aldrich replacing carbon electrodes by feel in 50-degree heat, night after night, preparing for a war they were never allowed to fight. And a unit in France had just built the same thing from spare parts, because the secrecy had been so complete, so impenetrable, that the men who needed it most had been forced to invent it again, from the beginning, with inferior equipment, because the alternative was going without. The secret had not protected the weapon. It had made the weapon disappear. Marsh stood up. He put on his coat. He picked up the report and walked to Cobb's office, 3 floors above, and told the aide outside that he needed 5 minutes. The aide said the general was unavailable. Marsh sat down in the chair across from the aide's desk and placed the report on his knee and waited 1 hour and 40 minutes until the aide, visibly uncomfortable, showed him in. Cobb was behind his desk, and a large man, correctly uniformed, with the steady eyes of someone accustomed to making decisions about other people's time. He looked at Marsh the way men in his position look at problems not yet fully contained. Marsh placed the report on the desk without speaking. He put his finger on the paragraph describing the 557th's improvised tactical light vehicle and waited while Cobb read it. Cobb read it. His expression did not change. "Your point, Commander?" "My point," Marsh said, "is that we have just been reinvented by accident, by men who did not know we existed." Cobb placed the report back on the desk with the careful movement of a man returning something to a position from which it can be ignored. The timing of operational deployment remains. There is no timing, Marsh said. There is no perfect moment. There is only the war, and it is ending, and we have spent 4 years preparing for a phone call that you have never allowed anyone to make. The silence in the office lasted several seconds. Cobb looked at him with the patience of a man who holds all the relevant authority and is deciding how much energy to spend demonstrating it. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Commander. That will be all." Marsh picked up his coat. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back, not at Cobb, but at the window behind him. Through it, through the grey Washington afternoon, he could see almost nothing. A strip of sky, a building across the street. He thought about Thomas Aldrich in the Arizona dark, replacing electrodes by feel. He thought about Petrov at a drafting table in 1935, measuring what most men would not bother measuring. He thought about 26 years. Then he walked out, down 3 flights of stairs, through a set of heavy doors, and into the cold. The war had 17 weeks left. The Rhine does not look like a river that changes history. Standing on its western bank in the early weeks of March 1945, what you saw was width. The river ran broad and dark between its banks, carrying the cold of the Alps in its current, moving with the authority of something that has been moving in the same direction since before there were men to watch it. On the far bank, Germany. Behind you, everything the Allied armies had bled through to get here, Normandy, the Hürtgen forest, the Bulge, all of it converging on this water. The Rhine was the last natural barrier. Everyone on both sides understood that. Cross it and the road to Berlin was open. Hold it and the war extended by months that would cost lives that could not be counted in advance. The Germans had destroyed every bridge along its length, every bridge except one, the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. On March 7th, American forces reached it and found it standing. The demolition charges had fired. The bridge had not fallen. It stood damaged but crossable, connecting 2 sides of a war that was almost over but not yet finished. The first American soldiers crossed within the hour. By nightfall, the Germans understood what they had lost. They began trying to take it back. The attacks came in every form available, artillery first, then aircraft. Luftwaffe pilots flew sortie after sortie against the bridge, absorbing losses that an air force running on almost no fuel could not sustain. Then V-2 rockets, among the last operational, fired at a fixed target because the high command considered the bridge worth the expenditure. None of it worked. The bridge held. American engineers built pontoon bridges alongside it around the clock, widening the crossing, making the foothold permanent. Every hour the bridge stood, more men and equipment crossed. Every hour the German position became less recoverable, and then as the artillery and aircraft failed, they sent men into the water. SS volunteers, combat swimmers equipped with Italian underwater rebreather units, compact, producing no bubbles, giving no surface indication of a diver's position. They moved in total darkness and carried explosive charges designed to be fixed to pontoon supports below the waterline. In daylight, against a crossing defended by thousands of troops, this was suicidal. The swimmers knew it. They went anyway. The Germans had not planned for this darkness. 13 vehicles took positions along the western bank of the Rhine on the night of March 7th. At a distance, they resembled standard M3 Grant tanks. They had the right silhouette, moved with the right weight. But where the turret should have carried a gun, there was an armored cylinder. And inside that cylinder, behind 65 millimeters of hardened steel, Marcus Petrov's arc lamp waited. Company C of the 738th Tank Battalion had trained with their gizmos in the Arizona desert, then in England, then through the slow, grinding advance across Europe. Most had never fired the system in combat. They had existed in a kind of limbo that only soldiers know, skilled, prepared, and increasingly uncertain whether the preparation would ever be called upon. The call came on the Rhine. The T-10s moved to their positions in the dark, engines idling, shutters closed. The operators inside, young men who had learned to replace carbon electrodes in blackness, settled into the focused stillness of people who have waited a very long time and can feel it ending. The order came through. The shutters opened. 13 beams erupted across the surface of the Rhine simultaneously, cutting the water into hard white light from bank to bank, strobing at 2 cycles per second. Petrov's rhythm, the one calibrated to the exact frequency of human biological failure, the one that turned pupils into machinery running the wrong program. The German swimmers, who had entered the water expecting darkness, found themselves inside the sun. Some stopped swimming. The disorientation was total. The strobing light destroyed depth perception, destroyed the horizon, destroyed the body's ability to locate the surface of the water relative to where they were. Men who had trained extensively and were genuinely brave simply could not function. Their biology had been removed from the equation. Those who kept moving were visible from 300 yards. The defenders could see everything. The swimmers could see nothing. The exchanges were brief. A German officer was pulled from the water downstream that night, still wet and cold, trying to understand what had happened. In his debrief, conducted through an interpreter in a requisitioned farmhouse, he said something that the debriefing officer wrote down and included in his report verbatim. We did not understand what those lights were. We swam toward them because we could not tell where else to go. And then we were being shot at, and we still could not see where the fire was coming from. The Ludendorff Bridge held that night. It would collapse 17 days later from accumulated structural damage, but by then the pontoon bridges were operational, the crossing was permanent, and the question of whether Germany could stop what was coming had been answered. Project Beacon had fought its first battle. It had worked exactly as every test, every demonstration, every report Marsh had ever written had said it would. The phone call had finally come. It was March 1945. The war in Europe had 9 weeks left. Operation Plunder began on the night of March 24th. The crossing of the Rhine at Ries was the largest assault river crossing in the history of warfare. 150,000 men, thousands of vehicles. The 51st Highland Division going in on the water while overhead, the sky filled with the largest airborne operation since Market Garden. The whole apparatus of Allied power aimed at a single point on a map designed to crack the last coherent German defensive line in the west. In the hours before the assault, the T-10s moved to their positions along the western bank. Their role was not dramatic, it was practical. Their beams, angled upward at low elevation, reflected off the cloud cover above the river and produced what the operators had started calling artificial moonlight, a diffused, sourceless illumination of the far bank, bright enough to navigate by but too soft to give German gunners a clean target. The far bank materialized out of the dark like a photograph developing in a tray. German positions became visible, German movement became trackable. For the men crossing in assault boats, the artificial moonlight was something they had not expected and could not explain. A sergeant from the Highland Division would describe it years later as the feeling that someone had decided to be kind, that the darkness had been taken away not by chance but by decision, that somebody, somewhere, had thought about them specifically. He did not know about Camp Baus. He did not know about Marcus Petrov or carbon electrodes or 26 years of closed doors. He knew only that he could see where he was going and that this was not something he had expected to be true. The crossing succeeded. The Rhine reports arrived on Marsh's desk on a Tuesday morning in early April. He read them twice. Then he walked to the window of his office, the one without a view, and stood there for a long time looking at the wall of the building across the street. 13 vehicles, 1 river, 3 weeks. He had given 26 years for 3 weeks. He had walked away from his pension, spent another man's money, watched a Hungarian engineer measure tolerances in fractions that required magnification, sat in 4 separate rooms and listened to 4 separate sets of uniformed men explain patiently why he was wrong. He had been moved to a windowless office and written reports to a man who did not read them. And somewhere on the Rhine in the dark, a young man had replaced a carbon electrode by feel and opened a shutter, and the thing had worked. Exactly as designed, exactly as tested, exactly as he had said it would in 1916 in a Washington briefing room to men who nodded the way men nod when they have already decided the answer is no. He did not feel vindicated. Vindication requires someone to acknowledge the wrong. What he felt was quieter and harder to name. The weight of being right too early in a world that only rewards being right at the correct moment. A moment controlled by someone else. He folded the report. He placed it in the drawer. The following week, the promotion notice for Walter Cobb arrived through the same administrative channel. Brigadier General to Major General. Commendation for outstanding management of special weapons classification programs. Marsh read it once. Then he placed it face down on the corner of his desk and did not touch it again. After VE Day, the dismantling was swift and quiet. The T-10s were recalled from service, stripped of their light systems and in most cases reduced to scrap metal. The M3 Grant hull was obsolete by 1945 standards. The armoured cylinders followed. The generators, the shutters, the mechanisms calibrated to 2 beats per second. Marcus Petrov returned to academic work. The Marsh-Petrov Syndicate was dissolved on paper, its records filed in boxes that were subsequently classified and then, gradually, lost. Of the several hundred T-10 vehicles produced, almost all were scrapped. Of all that metal and engineering and human effort, 2 vehicles survive today, one in England, one in India. The documentation that might have explained in full technical detail exactly what Petrov achieved and how it worked is largely gone. Walter Cobb received his promotion, then a second commendation, then a comfortable retirement in 1948 with full honours. Project Beacon was officially declassified in November of 1945. The notice appeared in no newspaper. No press conference was held. The weapon that had required the most aggressive security apparatus applied to any non-nuclear program of the war was allowed to become history quietly without ceremony, like something placed in a drawer and gently closed. Thomas Aldrich came home to Maine in August of 1945. He was 20 years old. He had served 2 years in the most secretive weapons program the United States ran outside of Los Alamos. He had been trained in a skill so precise it applied to exactly one system that no longer existed. He had been escorted home by armed military police and watched his mother write letters to senators who answered with single sentences. He had never fired his gizmo in combat. The 736th Tank Battalion, his unit, the one the men called the Kid Battalion because most of them were 18 or 19 when they arrived, had been converted to standard Sherman tanks before the Rhine operations. They had fought through the Battle of the Bulge in regular armour, alongside regular units, doing the things regular tank crews do. The old lady had been crated and sent somewhere he was never told. He arrived at the bus station on a Tuesday afternoon in late summer. His mother was there, his younger brother. A few neighbours who had heard he was coming back. Nobody mentioned the military police from 2 years earlier. It had been absorbed into the social fabric of the town without being fully processed, acknowledged in glances, never spoken. Someone asked him what he had done in the war. He said, "I was a driver." This was not entirely false. He had driven. But the truth of what he had driven and where and why and what it had been designed to do, that he folded away somewhere inside himself and did not take out. The years passed. He married. He had children. He worked for 30 years in the timber industry, the work of Maine men, physical and honest, and entirely disconnected from armored cylinders and arc lamps. He was a good father, a good neighbor. His children would say later that he was a man who did not speak much about himself, but who paid close attention when others spoke. That he had the quality, uncommon enough to be worth noting, of making whoever he was talking to feel that what they said mattered. He never told them about camp bows. He kept his silence with the completeness of a man who had been trained to keep it. And the training had outlasted the war by decades, and by the time the training no longer legally applied, the silence had become simply who he was. In 2007, Thomas Aldrich was 82 years old. His wife had been gone 3 years. His children were in their 50s. He lived in the house he had built in the 1960s, outside the town where he had grown up, with a view of trees and, in winter, a strip of lake visible through the bare branches. His memory was going. Not catastrophically, not all at once. The way memory goes in old age, the recent things becoming unreliable, while the old things, pressed deep by the weight of youth and intensity and experiences that mark a person permanently, those stayed sharp. Sharper sometimes than anything that had happened in the decades between. He began to talk. To his son first, a high school history teacher who visited on Sundays and had learned the patience of letting his father find his way to what he was trying to say. About Arizona, about the desert cold, about a machine he was never allowed to name, that he had spent 2 years learning to operate, that he had never once fired in the purpose for which it was built. His son listened with the attention of someone who understood that what he was hearing did not usually survive long enough to be said out loud. After each visit, when his father had gone to sleep, the son sat at the kitchen table and wrote down everything he could remember. He did this for months, Sunday after Sunday, until he had something resembling a record. Then he made calls and wrote letters, and eventually reached a researcher at a military history organization who confirmed with undisguised excitement that what the old man had been describing was real, documented, and known to almost no one outside a narrow community of specialists. In an interview published in a regional paper in 2008, Aldrich's son said something the researcher later quoted, and that has traveled through various forms of retelling ever since. He kept that secret longer than the war lasted, longer than the classification lasted, longer, I think, than he understood why he was keeping it anymore. We only really learned who he was after he started forgetting everything else. Victor Marsh died in the spring of 1959. He was 77 years old. His obituary ran 4 sentences in a naval publication. It mentioned his years of service. It mentioned his rank. It did not mention Project Beacon or the Marsh-Petrov Syndicate or 26 years of closed doors or the Rhine. His daughter, clearing his apartment in Virginia, found a single photograph in the drawer of his bedside table. A dark image, poorly exposed, showing what appeared to be a tank on flat desert ground at night. In the background, barely visible, a suggestion of a beam cutting across the frame. White against black. There and gone. She did not know what it was. She kept it anyway. The Ludendorff bridge towers still stand on both banks of the Rhine at Remagen, preserved as a monument. People visit from all over the world. Inside one of the towers there is a peace museum. None of the exhibits mention the lights. The men who built the light received no public recognition. The engineering Petrov produced, the mechanical shutter calibrated to the frequency of human biological failure, the armored aperture that protected a light source against direct fire, the arc lamp mounted inside a tank, and aimed not at a target, but at the eyes of anyone who stood in the way. That engineering dissolved back into classified files, and then into scrapped metal, and then into the silence that covers things no one has organized the effort to remember. 3 weeks. In a war of 2,000 days, a weapon no one is allowed to request is not a weapon at all. It is a beam of light waiting in the dark for a phone call that never comes.